She returned to the Alpha King's territory. Not for love, not for forgiveness, but to end everything he had built. But the moment he saw her standing there, his world collapsed. Because she wasn't alone anymore. She was carrying his heir. In a world ruled by bloodlines and beasts, packs lived by one law. The Alpha's word was life, and rejection was death. She was once chosen, marked as Luna, then discarded like she never mattered. No explanation, no mercy, just silence. But what the Alpha King didn't know was that silence always comes back with consequences. And she had returned to deliver every single one of them. But not as the girl he rejected. Something had changed. Something irreversible. And the entire pack would feel it soon. Because fate does not forget. And neither does she. There are moments in history that do not announce themselves. No warning. No mercy. Only consequence. And in the territory of the Blackridge Pack, that moment arrived the day she returned. Not as a rumor. Not as a memory. But as something real enough to make the ground itself feel unfamiliar beneath every step that followed. The gates did not open for welcome. They opened because they had no choice. And as they slowly parted, revealing the long-forgotten path into the heart of the Alpha's domain, even the guards trained to face death without blinking forgot how to breathe. Because recognition is not always a gift. Sometimes it is a warning. Whispers began immediately. Not loud. Not controlled. Fragments of disbelief slipping through hardened warriors who once swore her name meant nothing. She was not supposed to return. Not after the rejection. Not after the silence that followed her disappearance. And yet she walked forward as though time had never touched her. No hesitation in her steps. No glance toward the guards who once turned their backs on her. Only forward motion. Deliberate. Certain. As if she had already accepted every possible outcome long before arriving here. Her presence felt different now. Not softer. Not weaker. But heavier in a way no one could immediately explain. Like survival had reshaped her into something quieter. And far more dangerous to underestimate. And then it happened. The doors of the Alpha's hall opened. Not slowly. Not ceremonially. But with the weight of authority pressing outward as if the building itself recognized what was about to unfold. And he stepped out. Kael Vireon, the Alpha King. A name spoken across territories with caution rather than admiration. A ruler built from control, dominance, and decisions that rarely left room for hesitation. His presence alone was enough to silence a room. But this time, it was different. Because the moment his eyes landed on her, something fractured behind his expression. Not outwardly. Not yet. But deep enough that even his breath faltered for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. As though his instincts had recognized a truth before his mind could process it. She was not the same woman he once cast away. That much was immediate. But it was not only her appearance that unsettled him. It was the air around her. The scent carried something unfamiliar. Something layered beneath what should have been there. Not just Luna essence. Something intertwined. Something connected in a way that did not belong to the past. Kael's gaze narrowed slowly, calculating. Searching for logic where instinct was already beginning to fail. And then he spoke. You came back. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. Authority did not require volume. It required certainty. But she did not respond as she once would have. There was no submission in her posture. No trace of the woman who once stood before him hoping to be chosen. Instead, she met his stare with a stillness that carried its own weight. And when she finally spoke, her words did not carry anger. They carried distance. I didn't come back for you. The courtyard shifted. Not physically. But in this way attention tightens when something unexpected enters a space already defined by power. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. Because defiance in front of an Alpha King was not common. And silence in moments like this is never neutral. It is anticipation. Kael did not move. But something in his expression tightened further. Not rage. Not yet. something more restrained, something that did not have a name it was willing to reveal. And then she lifted her hand, slowly, not dramatically, not to provoke, but with quiet certainty. She placed it over her stomach, and in that instant, everything changed. The silence did not just deepen, it collapsed inward. The courtyard, the guards, even the air itself seemed to freeze into recognition of something that could no longer be ignored. Kael's gaze dropped, not immediately, as though his mind resisted the direction his eyes were forced to take. And when he finally understood what he was seeing, the stillness between them became heavier than any command he had ever given. Because power does not always announce itself through dominance. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, and rewrites everything that came before it. There are truths that do not arrive gently. They do not knock. They do not wait to be accepted. They enter like a force already decided. And in that moment, standing inside the heart of Blackridge Pack territory, something unspoken began to shift between them. Not loudly, not visibly, but in this way silence suddenly becomes too heavy to ignore. Kael Vireon did not move at first. His gaze had dropped, locked onto the implication now resting between them like an uninvited presence. Seconds passed, then more. Too many to feel natural, too few to feel like distance. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to decide what reality was allowed to be. Finally, his voice came, low, controlled, but edged with something sharper than command. Explain. One word. Yet it carried the weight of an entire judgment. The guards around them shifted slightly, uneasy but silent. Because an alpha king does not ask questions like that unless something has already disturbed the foundation of certainty. And she heard him clearly. She always had. But she did not react the way she once would have. No flinch. No hesitation. No search for approval. Instead she smiled. Barely. Not the kind of smile that softened a face. The kind that revealed what had survived behind it. Not warmth. Not forgiveness. Something hardened in silence. Something that had learned how to endure without breaking further. You rejected me, Kael. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. Every syllable landed cleanly. Measured. I stood in front of your pack. And you told them I meant nothing. A pause. Not for effect, but for memory. The kind that does not fade even when everything else does. She took one step closer. Then another. Slow enough for every witness to understand she was not retreating from anything anymore. But you forgot something important. The air tightened. Even the guards seemed to shift instinctively, as though distance itself had become uncertain. Kael's eyes followed her movement without blinking. Still unreadable. Still contained. But something beneath that restraint had begun to react. Not outwardly. Internally. Like pressure building behind a sealed door. She stopped. Close enough now that the space between them no longer felt like territory. Felt like a consequence. A breath passed. Then another. And in that narrow silence, she spoke. I was already carrying your air when you threw me away. The words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled. Deep. Irreversible. Like something falling into place that could not be undone once it had been spoken aloud. The courtyard did not react immediately. Simply failed to move. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, as though unsure whether it had permission to continue. A guard swallowed. Another shifted his grip on his weapon but did not raise it. No one spoke. Because some truths are too large to interrupt. Kael Vireon remained still. First, his expression did not change in the way others might expect. No immediate rage. No immediate denial beyond what had already been spoken. Instead, there was a stillness that felt heavier than emotion. As if his mind had stepped back from reality for a fraction of a second too long. Processing. Replaying. Searching for contradiction in a moment that refused to offer any. Then, slowly, his eyes darkened, not with immediate fury, but with something deeper, something less controlled, less predictable. Dangerous not because it erupted, but because it didn't. That's impossible. The words came, but they did not hold certainty. They tried to, but something inside them had already weakened before they left his mouth. As deep down, before logic, before pride, before the Alpha King's authority could intervene, there was recognition, a fracture in memory, a missing piece that suddenly made everything before this moment look different in hindsight. And that realization did not feel like victory. It felt like a collapse held together by discipline. He exhaled slowly, barely visible, but the air around him changed. Heavier, colder, more controlled again, but now forced. Because what stood in front of him was no longer just a woman who returned, and no longer just a rejected Luna. It was a consequence he had already created, and failed to understand at the time it mattered most. And in that silence, something unspoken began to form between them. Not forgiveness, not anger, but the beginning of a truth neither of them had finished paying for. And the worst part was that Kael Vireon already knew, even before he admitted it to himself. He had not been ready to hear it, but it had been true all along. No one moved. Not the guards. Not the elders watching from the upper terraces. Not even Kael Vireon himself. Because in moments like this, authority does not vanish. It recalculates. The Alpha King stood there, motionless, as if the world had briefly stopped obeying him. But beneath that still exterior something was shifting. Not loudly, not violently. Something internal, like a sealed chamber finally recognizing pressure it could no longer contain. Her words lingered in the air. Not as sound anymore. As a consequence. And yet she did not step back. She remained exactly where she was, as though distance no longer mattered. As though she had already crossed every boundary that once held her in place. Kael's gaze remained fixed, but it was no longer focused on her face. It had dropped again, lower. Not in disbelief now, but in calculation. The kind that searches for missing fragments in a reality that suddenly feels incomplete. A memory surfaced. Uninvited. Faint. The night she vanished. No witnesses who spoke clearly. Only fragments of confusion. A scent that lingered longer than it should have. A silence that felt interrupted. His jaw tightened. Barely visible. Then released. Only to tighten again. Around them, the atmosphere grew denser, as if the territory itself recognized the shift in balance. She finally broke the stillness. Not with urgency. Not with fear. But with something quieter. He never asked where I went. A silence. A controlled breath. I didn't disappear. Her eyes lifted slightly, meeting him again. I was removed. That single phrase altered the temperature of everything present. A murmur threatened to rise from the gathered pack, but it never fully formed, because even they understood. Accusations spoken in front of an Alpha King are not casual. They are declarations. Kael's eyes narrowed. Slowly. Measuring every syllable like it carried hidden edges. Removed. The word left him in a tone that did not confirm agreement or denial. Only interest. She nodded once. Enough. No excess emotion. No dramatization. Just fact stripped of decoration. And you didn't question it, she continued, voice steady, because trusting them was easier than doubting your own decision. A silence followed. Not for effect, but because truth often creates its own silence. Kael's aura shifted. Not outwardly aggressive. More contained. Compressed. Like power being forced into a tighter space. One of the elders on the terrace finally stepped forward, attempting to speak. But stopped the moment Kael lifted a hand slightly. No command was spoken. None was required. Silence returned immediately. He exhaled once. Slow. Measured. Then spoke again. Lower than before. Not to the crowd. Not to the guards. Only to her. If what you claim holds weight. A pause. Long enough to feel deliberate. Then someone inside my council interfered with my judgment. The air tightened again. Because that was no longer personal. That was an internal fracture. She did not respond immediately. Instead she watched him. Carefully. As if studying whether this version of him was real. Or simply another mask formed under pressure. Finally she answered. They didn't interfere. A slight tilt of her head. They guided it. The word landed differently. Not as an accusation. As a structure. Something organized. Planned. Systematic. Kael's eyes darkened again. But now there was no confusion in them. Only recognition forming into something colder. The Alpha King turned slightly. Gaze shifting toward the upper hall where the elders remained. No one spoke. No one moved. But the understanding was already spreading. And then, a distant sound echoed from beyond the gates. Not alarm. No warning. Something heavier. A signal long buried in pack protocol. One that was only activated when the internal hierarchy was no longer stable. Kael heard it. So did she. And for the first time since her return, his expression changed. Not into rage. Not into shock. But into something far more controlled. Awareness. Because whatever was happening inside the Blackridge Pack was no longer centered on her presence. It had already expanded. And she wasn't the cause anymore. She was only the trigger. The signal did not fade. It echoed. Not across distance alone, but through structure itself, through corridors, stone, and buried systems designed to remain silent unless authority fractured from within. Every Alpha-trained guard recognized it instantly. Yet none reacted. Because reacting meant acknowledging what the sound implied. And that was something even warriors hesitated to accept. Kael Vireon stood still. But his attention had shifted completely now. No longer anchored to the woman in front of him. No longer bound to the moment that had reshaped his understanding. His gaze had turned inward toward the architecture of his own rule. As if seeing it for the first time without the illusion of loyalty. She noticed the change. Not in words. In presence. The shift of dominance that no longer felt centered. A redistribution of certainty. The Alpha King finally spoke again, but the tone had changed. Not louder. Not sharper. Stripped of excess. What did you uncover? A pause. His eyes returned to her briefly. That made them activate that protocol? The question was no longer about her claim. It was about consequence. She exhaled slowly. Controlled. Not relief. Not fear. Something closer to acceptance of inevitability. I didn't uncover it, she replied. A slight step backward this time, not retreat but positioning. I survived it. That distinction altered the weight of the conversation entirely. Kael's jaw tightened once more. A subtle reaction, but one that revealed strain beneath restraint. Behind them, movement began to ripple through the upper hall. Not chaos. Coordination. The elders were no longer observing. They were responding. Silently reorganizing influence. As if the signal had done more than warn, it had awakened a structure that had been waiting. Kael sensed it too. His posture adjusted. Slightly angled now, no longer fully facing her, but no longer ignoring her either. Divided attention. Rare for an Alpha King. And dangerous. She continued. Calm. Measured. They didn't want me dead because of rejection. A pause. The air seemed to compress around her words before they fully landed. They wanted me erased before the bloodline became traceable. That phrase cut deeper than anything spoken before it. Not emotional. Strategic. Kael's eyes narrowed again, but now there was no hesitation left inside them. Only alignment of pieces that had been missing for too long. A memory surfaced more clearly this time. Council meetings. Unusual insistence. Disguised urgency wrapped in concern. His own compliance. Not forced. Guided. The realization did not explode. It settled. He turned slightly away again, scanning the space as though distances could confirm internal truth. Then quietly. The air. He stopped. Not from doubt. from recognition of scale, because that word no longer represented lineage alone. It represented a shift in hierarchy. She did not interrupt. She allowed silence to expand. And in that expansion something else emerged. From beyond the courtyard. Closer now. Footsteps. Not rushed. Not chaotic. Structured. Multiple entry points engaging at once. Kael's eyes lifted toward the perimeter. His aura shifted once more, containing power tightening into readiness. But this time there was no surprise. Only confirmation. She noticed it too. And for the first time since arriving, her expression changed slightly. Not fear. Not relief. But awareness that the situation had moved beyond a single confrontation. It had widened. Kael spoke without looking at her now. They've moved faster than expected. A pause. Then colder. Which means they've decided the outcome already. The courtyard gates at the far end began to open again. Slowly. Deliberately. Not forced. Authorized. And whatever stood beyond them was not arriving as an intrusion, but as a succession. The gates did not burst open. They yielded. As though permission had already been granted long before anyone inside the courtyard became aware of it. Every guard shifted instinctively, yet none advanced. Because experience taught them a simple truth. When authority arrives through consent rather than force, resistance becomes irrelevant. A formation stepped into view. Not chaotic. Not hurried. Aligned in quiet precision. Elders of the inner council. Not all of them. Only those with influence deep enough to bypass normal command structure. Kael Vireon's gaze hardened immediately. Not in their presence, but at what their presence represented. A decision already made without him. The Alpha King did not speak. He observed, measured, catalogued. The woman beside him remained still, but her attention sharpened. Not toward them, toward the space between arrival and intention. Because that gap always revealed more than words. The leading elder advanced one step, then stopped at a respectful distance that felt more political than courteous. His voice carried calmly, controlled, carefully chosen. Alpha King. No greeting beyond the title. No warmth. Only positioning. Kael responded without turning fully. You bypassed protocol. A statement, not a question. The elder did not deny it. Instead, he inclined his head slightly. Protocol no longer reflects current risk assessment. A silence followed, heavy enough that several guards instinctively tightened their stance. Kael finally turned his head. Slowly. His eyes locked onto the speaker. Explain. The same word he had used earlier. But now its meaning has changed. Earlier it demanded the truth. Now it demanded justification. The elder gestured subtly. Not toward Kael. Toward her. She represents instability, he said. A slight pause. Then continued. Not because of her return. A brief glance toward the Alpha King. But because of what she carries. The courtyard seemed to contract. Even the sound felt restrained. Kael's expression remained composed, yet the air around him shifted again, gathering pressure in controlled layers. The woman did not move. She did not react outwardly, but her awareness deepened, because this was no longer an accusation. It was a classification. The elder continued. Lineage confirmation has reached a threshold. A second figure from the council stepped forward, voice quieter but sharper. Continuity breach is now active. Kael's jaw tightened slightly, not from surprise, from recognition of terminology. Those were not emotional words. They were procedural, system-level language used only when succession integrity was at risk. The Alpha King spoke again, slower this time. Who authorized this classification? A brief silence. Then the answer came. Not directly, but enough. The same lineage that placed you on the throne. That sentence altered the atmosphere completely. Not louder. Not dramatic. Structural. Kael's gaze shifted slightly upward for a fraction of a second. not confusion, calculation. Because that reference did not belong to present governance. It belonged to the origin authority, foundational power. Before him, before the current hierarchy, the woman finally spoke again. Soft, measured. You see it now. No accusation, no triumph, only acknowledgement. Kael did not respond immediately. His attention split between her words and the assembled council members. Then, a realization formed. Not suddenly, not forced, accumulating. Because every event leading to this moment, his decision, her disappearance, the silence that followed, the activation signal, the council alignment, none of it was isolated. It was a sequence, design progression, and he had been inside it from the beginning. His eyes darkened slightly, not with anger, but clarity sharpened into something colder. Behind the council formation, movement appeared again. Additional figures entering from side corridors. Not soldiers, not guards, archivists, record holders, witness class. The kind who only appear when outcomes must be preserved, not debated. The woman's gaze followed them briefly, then returned forward. Calm, steady. Because now she understood something else. This was no longer about proving the truth. It was about deciding which version of truth would be allowed to survive. Kael finally spoke. Low, controlled, but no longer uncertain. This was never a return. A pause. Then, it was a selection. The council did not deny it. And in that silence, the next phase of the pack's future quietly began to unfold. The word selection lingered longer than anyone expected, not because it was complex, but because it redefined everything that had already occurred. Kael Vireon stood at the center of it, no longer merely reacting to events, but beginning to understand the framework beneath them. Around him, the council maintained their formation, still, unshaken, as though the conversation had already passed beyond dispute. The woman exhaled once. Slow, controlled, not exhaustion, release of restraint that had been carried too long. Her presence, once treated as disruption, now sat at the intersection of multiple decisions made without her visible participation. She spoke again, calmly. No one returns to Blackridge by accident. A brief pause. Her gaze shifted across the assembled elders. Especially not after erasure orders are signed twice. That phrase tightened the atmosphere instantly. Kael's eyes narrowed. Not outwardly aggressive, internally aligned. Because erasure orders were not common procedures. They required consensus, reinforcement, reconfirmation, and duplication implied doubt inside the system that issued them. One of the elders stepped forward slightly, voice steady but no longer fully confident. The second authorization was not council-driven. Silence followed. He continued. It originated from the Royal Succession Registry. Kael's expression changed. Subtle, but absolutely. Because that registry was not advisory. It was foundational. Immutable structure tied directly to alpha lineage continuity. The woman tilted her head slightly, as if she had expected this point all along. Kael finally spoke. Who accessed it? No delay. No hesitation. The answer came, but not from the council. From a secondary presence stepping forward behind them. Archivist here. Voice precise. Access was authenticated through your genetic signature. A pause. Then continuation. Under pre-approved continuity contingency. The courtyard shifted again. Not physically, but in perception. Because that meant authorization had not been forged externally. It had been embedded. Waiting. Dormant. Kael's breath slowed slightly. Not confusion. Recognition forming into structure. He looked toward her again. Not as an accusation, but as an alignment of two realities that refused to remain separate. You were never outside the system, he said quietly. A pause. Then, you were inside it before I even realized. She did not deny it. because denial no longer served a function. Instead, she replied, I was placed where visibility would be lowest. A controlled breath. So removal would feel natural. The council remained silent. Not out of respect. Out of confirmation. Kael's attention shifted briefly toward the perimeter again. The movement outside had stopped expanding. Now it was stabilizing. Containment rather than escalation. That detail mattered, because it meant the outcome had already been selected somewhere above them. Not decided in the courtyard, but finalized elsewhere. He turned slightly toward the elders. Voice lower. Sharper. This wasn't protection. A pause. It was a containment of possibility. No one answered. Because disagreement would require authority none of them were willing to challenge directly. The woman took one step forward again. Not toward him. Past him. As if acknowledging that the conversation was no longer confined to personal history. It had expanded beyond both of them. Her voice softened slightly. But containment always creates pressure. A pause. And pressure always finds release. For the first time, Kael did not respond immediately, because he understood what that meant. Not as a theory, but as a consequence it is already in motion. A distant shift echoed through the structure again. Not alarm. Not intrusion. Activation. Secondary protocol. Hidden systems responding beyond visible command. Kael's eyes lifted slightly, and for the first time since her return, his certainty was no longer about control. It was about timing. Something inside the Blackridge Pack had already begun its next stage, and neither Alpha King nor Council presence was positioned at its center anymore. The activation did not announce itself with spectacle. It unfolded quietly, through systems no longer dependent on spoken command. Through pathways embedded long before present leadership understood their full scope. Across Blackridge Pack territory, subtle shifts began to occur. Doors that should have remained sealed disengaged without physical input. Guard rotations altered by unseen scheduling authority. Internal maps reconfigured at checkpoints that no longer requested permission. Not chaos. Adjustment. The kind that happens when control is transferred rather than lost. Inside the courtyard, Kael Vireon felt it before it was spoken. Not through sound, through absence. Certain links to command responses are no longer answered in the expected sequence. His gaze lifted slightly, scanning angles beyond immediate space. Then he confirmed it internally. Containment architecture had shifted alignment. The council noticed as well. Subtle tension passed between them. No one spoke immediately, because speaking confirmed awareness of loss. The woman stood at the center of it all, still composed, still measured. But now her stillness carried a different weight. Not uncertainty. Positioning. As though she had moved closer to something without physically changing location. Kael finally spoke. Not loudly, but with precision. This level of system override requires origin access. A pause. He turned slightly toward the archivists. Not council authorization. One of them lowered their gaze briefly. A sign of acknowledgement without verbal confirmation. The woman's voice followed, calm as before. Origin access does not belong to the present hierarchy. A brief pause. Only to inheritance pathways. That word again shifted the balance. Inheritance. Not a rule. Not title. Structure beneath authority. Kael's expression tightened subtly, because inheritance pathways were not part of active governance. They were legacy frameworks, designed to activate under conditions no longer routinely discussed. One of the elders attempted to intervene. Voice careful. This level of activation was never expected to converge with living succession. He stopped himself. Too late. Because even that phrasing confirmed uncertainty within the system. Kael raised a hand slightly, silencing him without effort, then turned his attention fully toward the woman. For the first time since her return, his gaze carried something closer to focus than command. You are not a variable, he said. A pause. You are a key. She did not react immediately, then answered. Not by choice. Silence settled again. He studied her for a moment longer, not as ruler, but as someone evaluating continuity that no longer followed familiar logic. Behind them, another shift occurred. This one is deeper. Structural resonance through the lower foundations of the pack's central hall. A low pulse echoed through stone and reinforced corridors. Not audible as sound alone, but I felt like a heartbeat returning after long dormancy. Kael turned slightly toward the direction of the vibration. His eyes narrowed. The council reacted differently this time. Some stepped back half a pace. Not fear. Recognition. Because that pulse corresponded to sealed architecture. A chamber not accessed in generations. The woman's gaze followed the same direction. Her expression changed for the first time since arrival. Not a shock. Awareness sharpening into clarity. Kael noticed. What is that? He asked. The question was not rhetorical. It was precise. She answered after a brief pause. The point where selection becomes execution. That statement altered everything present. Not emotionally, functionally, because execution implied outcome finalization, not negotiation, not debate, completion. Kael's aura shifted subtly, containment tightening again, but now directed outward. The council began to reorganize their stance instinctively, not toward her, toward what was approaching from beneath them. A deeper sound followed, slower, heavier, as if something long restrained had finally acknowledged its moment to surface. Kael spoke once more. Low, controlled. Explain what is activating below this structure. The woman's eyes remained fixed forward. Her answer came quietly. It is not activating. A pause. It is remembering. And at that exact moment, the ground beneath Blackridge Pack headquarters responded. The response from below did not rise. It expanded, not upward, but outward, through structural memory embedded within the very foundation of Blackridge territory. Stone that had been silent for decades began to resonate in layered sequence, as though acknowledging something long denied access to surface reality. Within the courtyard, Kael Vireon remained anchored in place, but his awareness shifted downward, tracking the origin of the disturbance with increasing precision. Not instinct alone. Confirmation through fragmented system feedback now reawakening after prolonged dormancy. The council reacted first. Subtle withdrawal of presence from central alignment. Not retreat. Repositioning. Because when foundational architecture responds independently, leadership becomes observational rather than directive. The woman stood still at the center of it all. But now her stillness felt different. Less like endurance. More like synchronization. As if something beneath the territory had begun to recognize her as a reference point rather than an intruder. Kael finally spoke. Measured. What exists under this compound? No one answered immediately. Not because they lacked information. Because language failed to align with what was being felt through structural vibration. One of the archivists stepped forward. Voice controlled yet restrained. Restricted lineage vault. A pause. Then clarification followed. Predating current alpha governance. The phrase carried weight beyond its simplicity. Kael's eyes narrowed slightly. Not at the answer. At the implication. He turned briefly toward the council. So this predates me. No denial followed. Only silence. The woman finally moved again. A single step forward. Not toward Kael. Not toward the council. Toward the direction of the vibration itself. Her voice lowered. Calm. But now carrying something aligned with recognition rather than explanation. It predates all current claims to authority. A pause. And it was never meant to stay closed permanently. Kael watched her closely. No interruption. Observation. Because her familiarity with the phenomenon exceeded expectations. That detail mattered. More than emotion. More than narrative. Behind them, the ground responded again. A deeper pulse this time. More structured. like adjusting internal state after long isolation. Then, a faint fracture sound echoed from beneath the central hall. Not collapse. Release. The council members stiffened. Not outward panic. Contained realization spreading across their ranks. One voice broke from the upper tier. This should not be possible without sovereign confirmation. Another responded quickly. Sovereign signature is active. Silence followed immediately, because that statement contradicted established understanding of Kael's current position. He had not initiated anything, and yet something beneath them was responding as if he had. Kael's gaze sharpened. Slow. Deliberate. He looked toward the woman again. Not accusation. Verification. You said this was triggered by inheritance pathways. She did not deny it. Instead, her answer came with quiet precision. It responds to proximity. A pause. To continuity it recognizes. That distinction shifted the tension again. Not ownership. Recognition. The implication was no longer about control. It was about legitimacy encoded beneath governance itself. Another sound emerged from below. Closer now. More defined. Like mechanisms disengaging after prolonged sealing. The courtyard floor near the central hall began to show faint linear illumination. Not fire. Not energy in the traditional sense. But structural awakening patterns mapping something long hidden. Kael took one step forward. Then stopped. No hesitation. Assessment. Because forward movement now meant entering a domain that predated his authority entirely. The woman did not stop. She continued forward. Slow. Certain. As though following something only she could interpret correctly. Kael's voice followed her. Controlled. Where does it lead? She answered without turning back. To what was decided before any alpha wore the title. A pause. Then softer. And to what was hidden when that decision was challenged. Behind them, the council remained frozen in layered uncertainty. Because what was unfolding was no longer a dispute between individuals. It was reactivation of the origin framework. And origin frameworks, once awakened, do not ask permission to proceed. The illumination beneath the courtyard did not intensify. It is organized. Lines of faint energy traced patterns across stone that had never been meant for visibility, revealing structure beneath structure, like a hidden language finally deciding to surface after generations of silence. Every observer felt it differently. Guards interpreted it as instability, council members as reactivation anomaly. Kael Vireon as something far more precise. A system recognizing alignment. The woman continued forward without hesitation. Each step seemed to correspond with subtle shifts in the illuminated patterns, as though the ground itself was responding to her presence rather than reacting to it. Kael followed at a controlled distance. Not pursuit. Observation under restraint. Behind them, the council remained stationary, unable to reassert command over a process that no longer acknowledged their authority as primary input. The air grew heavier near the central hall threshold. Not from pressure alone. From anticipation embedded in the structure itself. Then it appeared. A seam in the floor. Not a crack formed by stress. A deliberate separation. Slow. Measured. Like something unlocking after confirming identity. The woman stopped directly above it. Her expression remained composed, but her focus sharpened. Kael stepped closer. Voice low. This chamber was sealed before any recorded succession cycle. She nodded once. Because it wasn't meant to be accessed through rule. A pause. Only those present understood the weight of that distinction. She continued. It responds to the continuity it was designed to preserve. The seam widened slightly. No explosion. No force. Only release. From beneath a faint resonance rose. Not sound in conventional form. More like memory made physical. The council behind them shifted uneasily. One archivist spoke under breath. If this opens fully. He did not finish the sentence. Because finishing it would give shape to consequence none were prepared to define. Kael's gaze remained fixed on the widening seam, controlled, but no longer detached, because recognition was forming in him as well. Not of the chamber, of pattern, of repetition across decisions he once believed were independent, a structure too precise to be coincidence. The woman exhaled softly. This is where truth was separated from governance. A pause. And where inheritance stopped belonging to memory alone. The seam reached its full separation. A low internal light emerged from below. Stable, ancient, unreactive to external influence. Then, a final mechanism engaged. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with absolute finality. The ground opened fully, revealing descent into an interior space that had remained untouched since the earliest formation of Blackridge authority. No one moved immediately, not out of fear, out of recognition that whatever came next could not be reversed by hesitation or command. Kael finally spoke, not as Alpha King, but as a witness to something older than the title. What is inside? The woman looked down into the opening. Her answer came quietly. Proof. A pause. Then, of who was chosen first. And beneath them, the chamber began to breathe open. And as the hidden chamber fully awakened beneath Blackridge Pack, Kael Vireon finally understood. The heir was never the beginning of the story. He was the reason it had been rewritten in the first place.